Well, under Jonathan Smith, Oregon State football has been building slowly but surely, and heading into 2023, kind of seems like they've turned a corner.
Our Locked On Pac-12, your daily podcast on the Pac-12 Conference. It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On Pac-12. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with our media rights-free and beloved Conference of Champions. Like, comment, subscribe, please, and thank you wherever you listen to or watch this show. Today, we have Carter Bahns, who writes for 24/7 Sports at their national desk, also part of beaverblitz.com. Carter is our Oregon State guy here on the show. We appreciate him coming back on as always. And Carter, you look at these preseason win totals, which I think we're going to be talking about for the next 2 weeks here on the show because there's just so much to break down, and I'm here for all of it. Oregon State has the same win total as Utah, the two-time defending champions, as UCLA, who have Chip Kelly as their head coach. Imagine that sentence 9 years ago in the Pac-12. Oregon State football with the same over-under win total as a Chip Kelly coached football team. I think that says a lot about where Oregon State is right now because, you know, our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook are telling you they buy into what Oregon State is doing.
That graphic that you just flashed for the YouTube viewers, I think tells the story. You've got Oregon State one win off from the top spot in the Pac-12. I mean, you know, you've got USC, Oregon, Washington up there at 9.5, and Oregon State's at 8.5. And, you know, I think for the Beavers to be in the consideration with those top tier teams in the conference, I think that is indicative of, like you said, Oregon State turning a corner because, you know, for as much success as Oregon State has found under Jonathan Smith over the last couple of years, their win totals have still been, you know, pretty mid-tier in the Pac-12. And I think that's, you know, part of the reason why Jonathan Smith has exceeded his win total in essentially every year since taking the job. You know, you can throw out the COVID year, and then I can't remember exactly what his projected win total was in his first season. But outside of that, Oregon State has not only exceeded, but dramatically exceeded its win total most years under Smith. And so now to see it set at 8.5, it's like, well, you know, if he exceeds that, Oregon State's going to be in some serious title conversations, which I think is obviously the next step for the program. But the fact that we're talking about that for Oregon State now, I think really does tell the story of the Beavers arriving here as we enter year 6 of the Smith era. I always lose track because the COVID year throws me off, but I think it's year 6.
It has been quite a while. It's been a slow and steady build, but it has been steady. And last year on this pod, Carter, you and I talked about how Oregon State was one of the easiest overs in the league. You know, I liked Oregon State over, I liked Arizona over, and I liked Colorado under. Those are kind of my 3 best over-under picks for a season ago. I think there are a lot tougher selections across the board this year, specifically with regards to the Beavs, because you look at their schedule, Carter. They've got 2 Mountain West opponents, one at home and one on the road, just as they had a year ago. And then they have an FCS opponent sandwiched in between them there in UC Davis. So I think they have a good chance once again to start 3-0, and it'll come down to conference play. But last year we came on here, their win total was 5.5, and we were both going, that is a hammer the over, right? They were a 7-win team the year before. They had a lot of returning production. The offensive line was going to be really good. That all played out, and they went and had a 10-win season for the first time since 2006. But they are it's a tricky situation to be in now with that particular number of 8.5, because it's like you want to pick them to go over again, but then you'd almost, I mean, they could go 9-3 because this is just regular season win totals that we're talking about here. You could pick them to go over without being in the position where you're picking Oregon State football to do something they've never done in program history. But then on the flip side, Carter, everybody has a moment, an era where you take a step forward, and it feels like Oregon State could be there right now. But I don't look at 8.5 and feel strongly one way or the other. It wasn't one of my favorite over-under bets that I talked about on the show when these numbers first came out from FanDuel.
No, this feels like the first year in probably about 5 years that the win total is aptly set. More often than not, I've had a pretty strong opinion one way or another, and usually it's been to take the over on Oregon State. But 8.5 really does feel like the sweet spot this year, because if you look at what Oregon State accomplished last year, 9-win regular season, it was a step forward from a 6-win regular season, a 7-win regular season the year prior. That trajectory is firmly upward. But it takes a lot to maintain that kind of success at a program like Oregon State. And, we talk about success not always being linear. I think Oregon State could go 8-4 this season, and we could still consider it a success. They could finish with 9 wins in a bowl game potentially, beat some good teams along the way. And I don't think Oregon State fans would be terribly disappointed. That's just where the program's at right now, which again, I think is really impressive, because a couple of years ago, 8 wins would have been like historic for Oregon State. It would have suggested a massive leap forward. So now that is the expectation, delivering on it is a challenge, because Oregon State hasn't had expectations this high in a long time. So how does Jonathan Smith handle that? How do the players handle that? It's a good problem to have, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to look at the schedule and say, 7 wins seems more realistic, or man, they've got an opportunity to get to 10. And I think 8.5 really is like the perfect number there.
Yeah, I think Oregon State, Washington State, and Utah for me are the 3 teams that I would look at and say, wouldn't touch them, would not touch them, because I think it'd just be a 50-50 proposition at that point. I think Washington State is just as likely to go 7-5 or 8-4 as they are 5-7 or 6-6. I think that number is pretty perfectly set. I think UCLA is one of my favorite under bets at 8.5. I don't think they go over 8 wins. I think they're poised to take at least a little bit of a step back with what their quarterback situation is. I mean, they could still be a good football team, and Chip Kelly's a great offensive mind, but there's just a lot going on there. But Oregon State at 8.5, it does kind of depend on the schedule, which is a big part of, the context you have to add to these win totals, right? Like, I don't think Colorado has the same amount of composite talent as Stanford with all the players they've brought in. I think Colorado is a more talented team, but Colorado's schedule is a lot tougher than Stanford's, because Stanford has 2 non-conference games where they're going to be significantly better than the team on the other side, and Colorado has 1, and that's Colorado State, who might I don't keep in great touch with Mountain West football loosely, but I don't know if Colorado State's that much better than Hawaii and whatnot. But that's the easiest team. Like, there's no FCS opponent on Colorado's schedule. They've got a Mountain West team and 2 Power 5s. And so that sort of stuff definitely matters. Speaking of the Mountain West, Oregon State's got 2 such teams on their schedule, which could afford them an opportunity that they capitalized on last year. We'll talk about that after we talk about Birddogs, which are wonderfully comfortable shorts, and they fit beautifully. You don't need a belt. They fit right comfortably around your waist, not too tight, not too loose. They've got amazing versatility. You can take them out for a swim. You can wear them out on the lawn. You can wear them on the golf course if you want. They're not like, fancy golf shorts and whatnot, but there are plenty of courses that people play where you could go out there in bird dog shorts, because that is what they do. They're stretchy fabric, make your legs look great, and they are so unbelievably comfortable and easy to wear. So go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege. And when you enter promo code LockedOnCollege, all one word, they'll throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti style tumbler. Go get that tumbler at birddogs.com/lockedoncollege. Enter promo code LockedOnCollege. All right. So that schedule for Oregon State, Carter, similar to last year, you've got a Mountain West team on the road. You've got a Mountain West team at home, and you have an FCS opponent. So similar structure there for the Beavs, who started 3-0, lost a couple of games, and then finished the year incredibly strong with a backup quarterback, mind you. And they, of course, now have DJ Uiagalelei, who's slotted in there to be the starter. So the non-conference slate for Oregon State, they begin at San Jose State, then they host UC Davis and San Diego State. I don't think either of those Mountain West teams, we won't talk about UC Davis because that's not going to happen, especially not at Reser. Though I guess we didn't think Montana was going to beat Washington, but it's just different situations here when you look back in hindsight. Jimmy Lake, Jonathan Smith, different calibers of college football head coaches, I think we can safely say. So when you look at the beginning here, how likely do you feel it is that they start 3-0 once again going into conference play?
Highly likely. These are not the Mountain West opponents that Oregon State played last year. Fresno State and Boise State, perennial Mountain West championship contenders, some of the best teams at the group of 5 level over the last handful of years. Oregon State got both of those teams last year, took care of business against Boise State, went down to Fresno State, and really need kind of a miraculous comeback, to be quite honest, in order to pull off that win. But the Beavers did take care of business against higher level competition last year out of that conference. And I think when you look at a San Diego State team that took a step backwards last year, a San Jose State team that, while it has recently competed for Mountain West titles, it didn't last year. And I just don't think those programs have retooled enough to get onto the level that those two opponents from last year did. So I think Oregon State will be pretty considerably favored in both of those matchups. Obviously, one of them does come on the road, so there's a little bit of a wild card factor there, but San Jose State isn't, a crazy home field advantage. So I think Oregon State pretty comfortably opens the season 3-0. Letdowns happen in college football, but I don't think these are particularly dangerous games by any means.
Yeah, the scare they got from Fresno State last year, I think, is a testament to what Fresno State has been in football, a team that very nearly won inside Autzen Stadium in 2021, beat UCLA at the Rose Bowl that same season. That's what they are capable of delivering year after year, and they also had Jake Haener a season ago. Now, both these programs, though, San Diego State and San Jose State, we have seen them compete, particularly the Aztecs, at a high level at the group of 5. We've seen them poke their head in and out of the top 25 rankings from time to time. They've had some I'm pretty sure within the last 5 years, San Diego State has had a 12-win season, which, regardless of what conference you're in, it is mighty impressive. So I'm with you. The Beavs will be comfortably favored in both games. I suspect they will be fine, but I wouldn't sleep on either opponent for individual reasons, Carter. I wouldn't sleep on the San Jose State game just because it's week 1 and you're on the road, and the Spartans are going to be super fired up to try and pull a Power 5 upset. And then I wouldn't sleep on the Aztecs because I have seen them beat Pac-12 teams over and over and over and over again within the last decade or so.
Yeah, and obviously, San Diego State, I'm not sure how much this permeates down to the player and coach level, but the fact that there have been rumblings of San Diego State at the Pac-12, maybe they are out to prove something. Maybe,
hopefully
maybe they
by
play
that
with a little
time
bit of
we'll
an
know.
edge. Yeah, hopefully at that point, but one way or another, maybe that lends to a certain level of motivation that serves as an X factor. I don't know. But San Jose State, like you said, it's week 1. It's going to be in a pretty prime slot. That game actually moved from Saturday to Sunday with the anticipation that it'll be on one of the major networks in most likely a primetime slot, which is, kind of interesting considering it's a game at San Jose State. But I think that's kind of a testament to the draw of Oregon State right now as a pretty hot team in college football. But no, there's certainly like minor slip up factors with both of those teams. But I just don't see it. I don't think I could predict Oregon State to lose to either of them. And frankly, I don't think they'll be favored by less than a touchdown against either.
Well, let's keep working through the schedule here because it certainly factors into how you'd feel about, betting the over or under, or kind of just where their expected win range should be come this fall. Washington State on the road and Utah at home. That's a, shall we call it, brutal start to conference play? That is among the first 2 conference games that anybody plays. Colorado's got the toughest stretch going at Oregon and hosting USC, but this is just not exactly a walk in the park either. I would guess, though I fully expect Oregon State to be a good team again, I just feel like one of those games is going to fall into the loss category.
Yeah, it's not quite as brutal as last year. Their Pac-12 opener was against USC at home, and then they went to Utah the following week. So
that was bad.
Those were the two losses for Oregon State that I think really held them back. I think in hindsight, if you get one of those, Oregon State is tied for the second best team in the Pac-12, has a shot to get into the conference championship, and at that point, obviously, is a borderline college football playoff team. So, hindsight's 2020. You want to get one of those two games, but this is slightly easier just because one of those teams you're playing is Washington State instead of USC, and you get Utah at home on a Friday night. Should be a great atmosphere at Reser. But Washington State is a team that Oregon State, recently has taken care of business against, but for about a decade, Washington State had Oregon State's number. I mean, it was one of Oregon State's lengthier losing streaks in a series, and it took the longest to snap it. Taking until last year to get it done. Going to the Palouse, obviously, it's a moderately challenging road trip. Washington State, I think, is kind of the wild card team in the Pac-12, along with Arizona this year. Maybe, I guess you could throw Colorado into that mix. Don't really know what to expect from them. And so maybe early season, they're exceeding upon expectations. Who knows? I think it's a tricky matchup for sure. It's one of Oregon State's tougher road games of the season. But to get Utah at home, I think is absolutely huge. Because, if you're going to play Utah, you certainly do not want to play it at Rice-Eccles. And Oregon State has been one of the best teams at home in the Pac-12 over the last few years now. I think that's a big advantage. I wouldn't go on the record predicting a win right now, but it's much more winnable than it was last year. And if Oregon State is going to exceed 8.5 wins, that might be one that you need to get.
So whereas they had, I think there is kind of a similarity in the structure of Oregon State's schedule to last year, where you have a tough start to conference play, you have a tough end, but that means the middle, you're just going down a stretch of really winnable games. These are not all walks in the park, but you go after you host Utah, you go at Cal, you host UCLA, which is big. Then you have a bye. You go at Arizona, at Colorado, not the toughest teams to play on the road. Come back home and host Stanford before you host Washington and then go at Oregon. Now, playing at Autzen Stadium is always a tough thing, and Oregon State hasn't won there, I believe, since 2007, 6, 7. I think 7
It was the double overtime game.
Yep. I remember it very well. But sure I think that middle stretch, boy, I almost feel like if you are able to just split Washington State and Utah, I have a hard time finding more than two other losses on the schedule here for the Bees. I mean, I'm officially the biggest Cal fan on the internet. I think when it comes to commentating on college football, I think they are going to go over their 4.5 win total, and I think they're going to be a bowl eligible team this year and pull an upset or two. But I wouldn't sleep on that. But UCLA, I think they're a pullback team. Arizona, I don't think they're at Oregon State's level yet. Colorado and Stanford are way behind. I think those are 5 games. Given that you have UCLA at home, I think those are 5 straight games where Oregon State is going to be a favorite.
Yep. The fact that Oregon State's toughest games come at home, save for Oregon, is massive. Because last year, the schedule was kind of the one hiccup to predicting Oregon State getting to that 8, 9, 10 win threshold. Last year we said Oregon State had a pretty tough schedule. They handled it a lot better than I think we thought they would. But this year, the schedule lines up a lot more favorably. That's kind of how things work. If you get your tough games on the road one year, you're probably going to get most of them at home the next year. And that's the case for Oregon State. Utah, UCLA, Washington, all at home. I mean, we expect those to be top half of the conference teams. And to get 3 of those at home and then only have to face Oregon on the road out of the top half of the conference it's an incredible draw for Oregon State, especially with how much of a home field advantage Reser Stadium has proven to be, the fact that it will be back to full capacity this year with the renovations complete. I think Oregon State probably gets 3 of those tough games between Utah, UCLA, and Washington just because of the home field factor. And then if you take care of business against the teams that you are expected to beat on the road, Oregon State's looking at probably 9 wins minimum. I mean, it's easier said than done, but take care of business and beat a team that's, maybe slightly better than you at home. That's all Oregon State has to do.
Yeah, I look at the schedule, and the more I look at it, the more I think that the over is the play of that 8.5 win total. Because let's say you don't beat Oregon this year, that's 1 loss. Let's say you split Washington State and Utah, that's 2. Between Cal, UCLA, Arizona, Colorado, Stanford, and Washington, I mean, the road games are Arizona, Cal, and Colorado. Those are probably teams that are going to be towards the bottom half of the Pac-12, excuse me. I think it's a big scheduling break, not just to have that and to have the home road splits that we're talking about here, but also to play UCLA instead of USC. That's a big break, because we know how the scheduling pods work in the Pac-12, right? Is teams swing through and they rotate playing this team from the South, but not that team. And it's, the Arizona schools are a pair, the LA schools are a pair, the Mountain schools, Oregon, and the Washington schools. That's how the scheduling always works out for, former North and South teams. And it's why they kept that for scheduling purposes. But of course, divisions are no longer present in the Pac-12. And I'm glad that's the case, because divisions just don't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. So I think that's a huge break. And I always look at the road games, and I think your toughest road game is certainly Oregon, but then your next toughest road game is probably Washington State, who you're capable of beating. And I don't think, like, at the best case scenario for Washington State is that they are as good as Oregon State this year. So I don't think, other than Oregon, who we know Oregon State beat a season ago and is clearly capable of playing with, I don't see a road game here where Oregon State is outmatched.
Absolutely not, because obviously Oregon State beat Oregon last year. I think as Oregon State continues to build, it comes closer to reaching that tier that Oregon has been in for, a decade plus now. The perennial conference title contenders. I think Oregon State is knocking on the door of that group in the Pac-12. So, I mean, when you're talking about your second toughest road game being against Washington State, which I would have slotted in at 7th or 8th in the Pac-12, that is a massive win. I'm curious too, with the way the schedule lines up, what you think Oregon State's ceiling is, because I think the way that the home and road splits line up, I mean, if Oregon State wins all of its home games and beats all of the teams it should beat on the road, like, Oregon might be the slip up. Maybe, like, Oregon State could be undefeated going into the final week of the season. That's, I don't.
That seems like a stretch,
but it's possible.
I mean, it's more possible than it has been in past years, but I don't think anybody in the Pac-12, though there are a lot of really good teams, and I'm stoked for the season, I don't think there's anybody who's good enough to, be 11-0 going into the final week, or have 1 loss even going into the Pac-12 championship game. USC had that a season ago. I don't know if they can repeat that, though their defensive upgrades certainly make that more feasible, you would think, with Anthony Lucas and Bear Alexander along the defensive line. But you still have Alex Grinch as your DC, and that's still, I think, a fair question to ask, is like, can you really do it with Grinch as your defensive coordinator? Because Lincoln Riley teams have won conference championships before, gotten to the playoff before, but the defense has been a liability, and I don't think those Big 12 conferences were as good as the Pac-12 is going to be this year, certainly not with the depth of quarterback play. So let's wrap this discussion, Carter, and talk about the best and worst case scenarios here for for Oregon State. I think Washington State and Utah are solid teams, and that, whichever one you're going to play on the road was certainly going to be tough. You get the easier of the two, that being the Cougs, both Utah at home. I think best case scenario here, and I'm liking the over as we have had this entire conversation more and more, because I look at it and say, if you lose 3 games on this schedule, as long as you don't slip up to one of the Mountain West teams, 6-3 feels very, very manageable in league play for Oregon State. I think 10-2 is probably the best case scenario, but it kind of seems to me, I don't think Oregon State to me has got one of the bigger ranges in the Pac-12, given what their schedule setup is here. I think if you had a calamitous season, if DJU gets hurt and you have to run it back with Gulbranson and his limitations shine through, and there are questions about Aiden Childs, maybe 7-5 is the worst case scenario, but I think that is like the absolute scraping bottom of the barrel, bare minimum here, based on what we saw a year ago from Oregon State. I'd say 7-10, and I would take the over.
I like it. Yeah, I mean, I know I just said Oregon State could be undefeated going into the final week. Like, that is absolute best case scenario. I'm with you. I think
that's you pull off another Stanford win on the road where you win in the final seconds,
right,
and your team is just playing lights out, and you avoid a bunch of injuries too. Like that's the absolute upper limit would be 11 maybe.
Yeah, I would not go close to predicting that. I'm with you. I think 10-2 is the ceiling. That would probably include a loss to Oregon and a loss to one of those better teams that you're playing at home, be it Washington, Utah, or UCLA. I think more likely is 9-3, because those teams like Washington State and Arizona are going to be really sneaky on the road.
Mm-hmm.
Oregon State, like you said, almost had a letdown game at Stanford last year. It took a Hail Mary miracle for not actually a Hail Mary, but a similar play where Trayshawn Harrison made that impressive catch and then ran it about 40 yards for a touchdown for them to win that game. So it is really tough in the Pac-12 to win out, which obviously hasn't happened yet, or to only lose one game. So I think it's more than fair to predict Oregon State's going to lose 2 to 3 Pac-12 games. If it loses more than 3, that's a disappointment. And so that's why I think the floor is probably 7-8, but I would feel more comfortable saying 8 just because of how favorable the schedule is. So I think Oregon State's range of outcomes is probably 8-4 to 10-2. If things really, really pop and it's a truly special season for Oregon State, they're an 11-win team. If the bottom falls out and things, go disastrous, they win 7 games. But that's why I think this 8.5 win total is so spot on. I think 9 is more likely than 8, but I think that is probably the range that you'll see Oregon State this year.
Yeah, I'm with you that the games that you can reasonably see them losing at Oregon, of course, Utah, a good team. I think between Washington and UCLA, you could split, but I don't see them going 0-2 against both of those teams, given how they played Washington a season ago, and the fact that they should have won that game. I mean, like, they made some really, really key mistakes. I think they weren't willing to take field goals on the road, which I'm just not a fan of. Like, I'm usually aggressive, go for it on 4th and something, but when you're on the road, you drive down the field, you get in the red zone, you take points when given, because they can come back to bite you. It did, unfortunately, for Oregon State, but them having that game at home, I think is pretty big. And the other thing we've been doing here, Carter, real quick, is just what happens if Oregon State has the best case scenario, or what has to happen, and what do you think it looks like if the worst were to come to pass? If it's 7-5 for me, I would say injuries and DJ Uiagalelei playing his worst brand of football would probably be your biggest driving factors.
So the best case scenario is Oregon State's defense does not take a step back despite the loss of about half of your starters from last year. And I mean, expecting the defense to play at the same level, which led the Pac-12 in a number of categories last year, mind you, without all of those starters, without 6th and 7th year guys, that's a tall order. So I think expecting a step back is pretty realistic. But the best case scenario is that the defense retools, reloads, and is equally as effective as it was last year. And the addition of DJ to the offense helps you score more than what I think was in the low 20s per game or mid 20s per game last year. If DJ helps you unlock something in your offense and you score more towards the 30 points per game range and your defense doesn't take a step back, Oregon State's probably knocking on the door of a Pac-12 championship. The worst case scenario looks like the complete opposite of that. The losses on the defensive side really hurt. Your depth is tested by an injury or two, and you just can't quite work things out. The first year of the Trent Bray era looks more like a blip on the radar at that point in the grand scheme of things. Meanwhile, on the offensive side, DJ doesn't work out. Maybe you have to go to a backup and you give the keys to the offense to a true freshman in Childs, or Gulbranson's there and does his thing. I think that would limit the offense's potential. And if you combine those two things, that's how you get to 7 wins, maybe 8 wins. But again, I think it's more realistic that the defense is slightly worse than last year, but still very good. And that DJ elevates the offense to a point that you get more consistent production. And when you combine all of those things, I think that probably makes for a 8, 9, 10 win team.
Oregon State's win total is 8.5. Our win total, when we get Carter Bahns on to talk about stuff like that, it's infinity, folks. Carter, thanks so much as always, man.
Thank you.
Appreciate everyone listening. See you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.